I've got a different sort of painting this time. Okay, different is relative, I suppose. Yes, it is another transparent watercolor, and it features birds, so in those ways it's like most of my other paintings. But what is different in this one is that there's more of a wide-angle landscapey background than my usual work, and the birds are relatively small on the page. So, this piece is 12 by 18 inches, and is done on Arches 140-pound hot-press paper. I based it on a series of photos that I took at Eco Pond in Everglades National Park in Florida. I combined a bunch of different sketches from my sketchbook into a single composition and then transferred that to my paper. Afterwards, I used liquid frisket to mask off the birds and the main branches in the background so I could block those in quickly. I usually start on the largest areas needing to be covered first. In this case, that was the water. I planned on a wet-on-wet wash to get a smooth gradient, so I pre-wet my paper, making sure it was evenly saturated before bringing in the paint. I used a 1-inch flat brush to bring in a mix of some ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple, desaturated with a little bit of Indian red, followed by some dioxazine purple and quinacridone magenta. I hit that with the hairdryer to lock it all in. I flipped my page so it would be easier to reach the top elements and I'd be less likely to drip paint onto the freshly painted water gradient. Next, I used a number 2 round brush to introduce a little bit of my muddy shoreline colors using some burnt sienna mixed with a bit of ultramarine blue. The top of the page was going to have a bunch of dead mangroves in the distance. I returned to my 1-inch flat brush and made a gradient from warm gray made from Indian red and ultramarine blue to a mix of dioxazine purple and quinacridone magenta. This basically echoes the colors used in the water, but a bit more desaturated. I blotted up any extra pigment to prevent backruns and then hit it with the hairdryer. Afterwards, I finished covering up the white of the page by adding in some more of my muddy shoreline. Forgive me, I missed a portion of the recording where I added a shadowy wash to the bottom of the mangrove trunks to help it recede into the background more. Additionally, I added in some texture to the shoreline. Now you're all caught up. From here out, I was glazing in details by getting gradually darker in many layers, mostly using a number 2 round brush. Knowing that the mangroves were going to take the longest time to render, I went about painting in a background layer of branches by selectively darkening areas. My overall plan was to have the colors on the painting mostly muted in the background and less contrasty, so the black and white plumes of the birds will really pop off the page. I'll increase the saturation and the contrast as the reflections move toward the viewer. With the next pass on the mangroves done, I put in some more browns on the shoreline and then started bringing in the reflected waves in the water, starting with my same browns from the shoreline. I kept my brush strokes shorter and thinner in the distance and made them wider and thicker as they worked forward in the foreground. The colors I used were the same for the mangroves and mud as they were in the reflections. I left out some of the reflection areas, painting around where they will show up later. With the major background work blocked in, I removed my frisket from only the mangroves and left it over the birds so I could continue working on the water. And then transferred the rest of my foreground sketch using a tracing paper transfer. My next task was to cover up all the white that I had just revealed. I started by putting in some shadowy tones to get the overall lighting figured out. First, I added a light wash of phthalo blue and a little phthalo green to the bottom edge to help things recede more. Next, I started rendering some of my bigger branches as slightly warm-toned, and the rest of the mangroves as cooler colors. My thought was to bring in some of those warm, muddy tones to the other areas of the background. In hindsight, I think it might have been better to keep all the colors unified and just rendering the shoreline mud as less brown and more gray. Oh well, hindsight's 20/20. I'm usually doing these videos a week or so after the painting is finished, and you see things differently at that point, which is okay. I was trying something a bit different in this painting, and that can lead to some indecision. I also wasn't relying much on the reference photos that I'd taken. They weren't that great. It was an overcast day, and everything was devoid of color and interest. The massive dead mangroves was kind of interesting as a place to start from. It looked kind of bizarre because you usually have so much green and reflected blue in shots like these. It was basically trying to do something different than I usually paint. I wanted the scene to be a bit surreal with stripped back color and contrast on most elements other than the birds. Because this was so different and I was mostly making it up, it took a lot longer than it usually would. That could be a bad thing, but in general I find that if you're forging a new path, you tend to be learning the most. I'd say that although the top portion of the painting only accounts for about a third of the painting, it took up probably 75% of the time. There was a lot of detail to render, and it was a different style than my usual. It had all the sharp edges, but minimized contrast and saturation. I started adding more pinks using quinacridone magenta to the top of the page and having things progress more blue-green as they tucked in behind the muddy shore. I warmed up the non-mangroves as I went along, hoping to stitch in more of those earth tones from the mud. After adding some darker shadows to the area where the mangroves met the mud, I removed the frisket on the birds. I started putting in my first passes of paint on the birds, starting with the stilts' legs, and then began putting in the color on one of the stilts' blackish backs. At that point, I realized I'd be better off quickly putting in a suggestion of the shading over all the birds' white bodies with some ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple to establish my overall lighting. Once that was put in, I continued adding in the lightest areas of the birds' blackish backs using a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. With that accomplished, the birds just got a lot of glazing to bring in the detail. The stilts had more blue-black wings and backs, while the avocets were more of a brownish black. As is typical, the birds went in really quickly. First, they represented only a really small amount of the surface area to cover, and second, the birds are always the easiest part. The backgrounds take the most time. Both of these species have crazy thin beaks and legs, so I used a 10-aught brush and rotated the paper so the directions of their beaks fit my hands better. For tiny details like this, you have to be slow and careful because if you're a fraction of an inch off, it just looks terrible. I put a lot of shading to the birds' white areas in order to give them more volume and depth. I was using the same basic colors on all the birds, which were also colors used heavily in the background elements, but I kept the birds' shadows more saturated. I was also using a lot of ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and phthalo blue for the shading. Moving forward, I was bringing in more and more darks, eventually working to a mix of near black made from alizarin crimson and phthalo green. I found myself working on the dark of the bird's wings and then switching over to working on the shadows and the light white feathers, trying to round things out and give it good depth. At this point, I started thinking the background needed some more work. The shoreline was unevenly rendered and needed to be unified with some more earth tones. I darkened it with some burnt sienna, desaturated with ultramarine blue, and sometimes some dioxazine purple, and then added in a purplish transition to the bottom of the mangroves. After that, I thought the mangrove branches needed a bit of sharpening up, so I brought in more shadows to build depth. I didn't want it very contrasty like the birds, but it needed some more definition than it currently had. It's amazing how much detail there actually was in that background of overlapping branches. They definitely took up the majority of time that I put into this painting. It was somewhere around this point that I started second-guessing myself about the background choices, especially the warmer fallen trees by the water. I was starting to find them distracting, especially the twisty stump on the right, which seemed to be a little out of place. My photos had that gnarly branch, so I drew it. Now I think it would have been better to straighten it out a lot. Having a visual element in that area makes sense, but there aren't many other twisty shapes like it anywhere else in the frame. So it was feeling a little out of place to me. That can be a problem with following reference photos too literally. Most things can be improved upon when you're editing. If this were an oil or an acrylic painting, I could just redo that section, but with transparent watercolor, you just have to live with it, and that's okay. I spent the rest of the painting almost exclusively working on the background, sharpening up edges and trying to get a good transition between the muddy shoreline and the mangrove roots and tree stumps. I wanted it to be fairly subdued back there without much saturation or contrast, but I did want a lot of clean and well-defined lines. Finding a good balance was difficult. After a lot of picking away, I decided I should stop before things got totally over-rendered in the background. Again, this painting was a different one for me. I wouldn't call it my most successful effort, but I was trying something new and different, so I came away satisfied with the final effort, and I learned a lot in the process. Well, thanks for watching. The next painting is of a nesting ruby-throated hummingbird. That should be great fun.